Pastor Michael Todd. He is the lead pastor at Transformation Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he is here to share an incredible message with us tonight. Listen, he is passionate about leading the lost and the found to Jesus Christ for transformation in their life. You are going to experience that tonight. Please give it up for Pastor Michael Todd.
What's going on, Switch? I said, what's going on, Switch? We can go places and hook up. What you don't know is that every time you hook up, you are joining to that person physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And it's supposed to be something that's never broken apart. And so that's why when you just hook up with that person and you rip it away, they always take a piece of you. Because it was supposed to be a bond that was only done with one person one time. And so if you're hooking up with them and you rip away, and then you hook up with them and you rip away, and you hook up and rip with them and you rip away, you will never be everything God called you to be, because people are walking around with pieces of you. Oh, I'm preaching good.
By now, the idea of purity culture has been widely spoken on by various religious figureheads, both positively and more likely negatively. And that negativity is warranted. The residents of purity culture within the larger landscape of Christianity should be a part of the conversation that needs to take place as we further examine some of these problems with evangelical Christianity. For a lot of people, the ramifications of Christian views on sexuality are still actively being dealt with, and even though some of these Christian communities have brushed this topic under the rug, either agreeing with it and ignoring it, or disagreeing with it and still just kind of ignoring it, the rest of us can't just move on. There have been centuries of sexual tension between the church and the rest of the world. And no, that doesn't mean that the world wants to have sex with the church, because this isn't all that sexy. But what it does mean is that the church has a lot of opinions about sex. Sex, after all, is where people come from. It's what our culture revolves around. It's a major source of contention even today between generations. And it's what I did to your mom last night.
A shouting hoe, a organ playing hoe, a choir director hoe. Hey, preacher, if what I just said describe your wife, you're married to a hoe. Nothing but a singing hoe, a shouting hoe, a organ playing hoe, a choir director hoe. You're nothing but a prostitute.
For many, purity culture represents a specific snapshot in time. Searching YouTube right now for purity culture related content, you can find a lot of people talking about the church's specific impact on their own sexual development, primarily in childhood. These are millennials, Gen X, and now some Gen Z kids, all exploring their growth and maturity and how it was affected by the shaming tactics and the manipulative analogies brought against them by their religious mentors. For instance, Rhett and Link of Good Mythical Morning have gone into excruciating detail of their particular sexual journey and how purity culture impacted that.
At a certain point, this struggle became such a cornerstone of our relationship that I began to believe that it was creating an insurmountable barrier. Like, I couldn't confess at a rapid enough rate that defined our relationship, to the point where we broke up just because we couldn't handle that anymore. And you know what it did? It absolutely broke my heart.
And people like this who have been affected in this way are not just sexually confused. A lot of them are no longer Christians. They are disillusioned with a church that has so directly harmed them, their wives, and potentially their children, that they have left. And I cannot blame them. Because of these descriptions and the people who are involved in these conversations, you'd be forgiven for thinking that purity culture was just a very specific theological push that was relevant more recently, like within the last 30 years or so. But the reality is that it goes back much further than that. The church has always had a vested interest in sexuality. The Bible speaks on the issues of sexual sin and sexual problems, not to mention more positive marital sexuality. Biblically, sex is a tool for both expression and more mechanically for the creation of more people, as well as functioning as a marital device. In the Old Testament especially, sex was a more important function of a marital relationship, not just because functioning married people had sex, but also because the relationship between sex and marriage was in equal parts 1-to-1. Or in other words, sex was what married people did. If you had sex, you were married, and if you did not have sex, you were not married. If you want to get really confused, you can also read about the obligations that sex has within a family relationship. For instance, an unfortunate situation arises in Genesis 38 between the family members of Judah. Judah has a couple of sons, one named and one named Onan. Gets married to a lady named Tamar. However, Judah's son, dies early on, before he and Tamar could conceive a child. Society in these days would demand that without a child, Tamar would basically just die. She would have no sons to care for her and no husband to own her, and therefore she would be judged as being hated by God, because God chose to discipline her by killing her husband. But, not to worry, ancient Hebrew society has a solution for Tamar, and her solution is Onan, her brother-in-law. Judah goes to Onan and tells him to fulfill his brotherly duty to his late brother and his brother's now widowed wife, and that brotherly duty is to go and just come inside of her. Yep, that's what God wants, because the social requirement for a woman is to have a son. Onan's duty religiously and to his family was to have sex with his dead brother's wife to give her that son. And the whole point of this story is that Onan doesn't want to do it. He does have sex with her because, let's be honest, how are you going to turn that down? But the Bible tells us that he would pull out, spilling his semen on the ground, in quotes, which the Bible tells us God identifies as wickedness, because this is a cautionary tale about a man taking advantage of a young widow, refusing to care for her properly, even though she's his own family. Sex is important biblically, because it is one of the ways in which men and women are mechanically different and dependent on one another. And functionally, sex needs to exist to procreate and fill the earth, and God does command the Israelites to make children and grow their numbers. Sex outside of marriage is frowned upon, but the concepts of purity are never mentioned. Sexual immorality is mentioned, but even in Scripture, sexual morality, which is not clearly defined, does not affect your body or self-worth, it's just sinful. But this biblical function of sex is not equal to the church's ideas of sexual relationships in modern times. Sex evolves as an issue into this huge, emotionally charged and poetic subject that the church simultaneously puts on a pedestal as an untouchable and perfect privilege between husbands and wives, while also describing it as the most dangerous thing in the world to anyone without a magic ring on their finger. It's hard to focus on the dangers of sexual activity for decades of young people's lives, yet simultaneously beat women over the head with how much they need to please their husbands in bed afterwards. And speaking of married people, there is one more important view of sex in the Bible that I think we should take a glance at. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about marriage in a very black and white way that we often glaze over in the current church world. First, Paul talks about marriage as the duties involved, the duties of the wife to the husband and the husband to the wife. But after that, there is a note to the unmarried. And the note is basically this: if you aren't married, then good. Don't bother getting married. Unless you're so horny you can't control yourself, then I guess go ahead and get married. Because I'd rather you be married than banging prostitutes. Not very pro-sex work of you, Paulie. Paul seems to suggest that really the better option for Christians is to never have sex with anyone ever. Marriage is simply for those that are too weak to control themselves otherwise. In fact, in the Catholic Church, they not only believe in the concept of a virgin birth for Jesus, meaning Mary did not have sex at all, and Jesus' birth was a miracle from God, but also there is a belief of Mary's perpetual virginity, or in other words, that even in the marriage of Mary and Joseph, in order to honor God for the gift of Jesus' miraculous birth, Mary and Joseph never consummate their marriage, leaving Joseph with nothing but a carpentry business and the first ever sub onto r/dead bedrooms. And we see the repercussions of this in some segments of Christianity still to this day. Catholic priests and nuns take vows of chastity. They do not get married, and they're not supposed to have sex with anyone ever.
I use my hand to wipe my tears, to kiss your mouth. I break my vow. No, 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 Jose, unless you want to.
And they take this vow to hold no person, including themselves, over God, even if that means when it comes to their sexuality. Did this work out? No. You can obviously see some sexual flaws with the Catholic Church, but even if we were to levy some criticisms at this, which there certainly are some, at the very least, I would have to admit that there is a more consistent biblical worldview in the Catholic Church than with the modern purity culture in the evangelical church. So how did we go from a religion that calls for us all to be completely without sex to one that is so hyper-focused on sex that it becomes one of the most important subjects of youth ministries across the country? Well, because the church is broken.
We should like double date or something. It's like, I don't need a boyfriend. Yeah.
It's your dad.
Yeah. I don't need a boyfriend because I have my dad.
You talk about yourself as your daughter's boyfriend. That's going to have a lot of people, make an awful lot of people uncomfortable. It's way too Freudian. How do you...
See, this is what I find absolutely humorous in our culture today, where something as pure as a daddy going out with his daughter on a date is twisted to make it seem like, as you mentioned, Freudian. I wasn't thinking about Freud at all. I was thinking about...
So in our last part of our purity culture series, the Old Testament taught us to bust in our sister-in-law. The New Testament told us not to bust at all. And we left that video feeling both sexually incomplete and confused, much like a modern-day Catholic priest. And also like a modern Catholic priest, now we must turn our attention to the children of our churches, because we are fast-forwarding quite a bit into the modern era. The sexual revolution is in full swing, the church is at a loss, numbers declining, the youth becoming more progressive and disillusioned, and at this point, the evangelical church is already dealing with a lot of problems from what it would describe as a socialist or even communist ideology, the civil rights movement. And while Dr. King's connections between racial injustice and economic injustice are being talked about, the fact is, in reality, some of these churches, especially in the South, were already looking for ways to poke holes in the theology of the civil rights movement anyways. And there's good reasons for bringing up racial tensions when we talk about the creation of purity culture, which admittedly won't be an actual mainstay in the cultural zeitgeist of evangelical churches until well into the 90s. And that reason, of course, underlines some of the earliest forms of purity culture's problematic ties. Purity culture, for many of my fellow 90s kids, was always viewed as a sexual ideology. But in the 60s, purity meant something else, and that's racial purity. And in an attempt to keep the youth in line, one of the main tactics of those opposing sides of the civil rights movement, when speaking to young women, would be to find any way possible to remind these young white evangelicals about the dangers of interracial sex. And in fact, it's not until 1967 that interracial marriage is even legalized in 16 of the last holdout states, all of whom refused to make mixed marriages legal, with Alabama even still refusing to marry mixed racial marriages for years afterwards, with some judges refusing to back off. So much so that Alabama citizens were forced to finally amend its entire constitution in reference to interracial marriages in the year, wait for it, 2000. Like, after cell phones existed. Holy Christ. Like, I am a millennial, and you mean to tell me that I was born years before interracial marriages were finally legalized in the Alabama state constitution? You know what else happened in the year 2000? The Segway was invented in the year 2000. Racial marriage in Alabama was constitutionalized the same year that the Segway came out. My God. And speaking of segues, that brings us to the modern era of evangelical Christianity. It's the 90s, and people are loving that baggy aesthetic, and I don't know, the Home Alone franchise. And the church is once again taking as much control over the younger generations as they can, because these younger generations are again, quote unquote, spiraling out of control. The youth are once again pushing back on the cultural ideals of the church. Homosexuality is slowly gaining in popular approval amongst the young. AIDS is an epidemic of huge proportions, so the church searches for a solution, and their solution is to go back to their heritage: conservative family values. White women marrying white men, popping out 3 kids, and making apple pies. They see as a threat the increasing cultural acceptance of women in the workplace and choosing careers and multiple sexual partners over traditional married life. Sex outside of marriage is targeted as a major factor of the erosion of quote-unquote Christian values, and the focus quickly finds itself at home with the traditional marriage and conservative family system that the evangelical church loves by focusing on young girls. Young men are assumed to be the future faith leaders of their households, and of course, these households are being indoctrinated by faith systems that are being led by male-dominated churches in a male-dominated society, but in that assumption, these household leaders are considered, ironically, both so strong that they must be in charge of their families, and yet also so weak that they must rely on the women around them to keep them from straying from their faith's call to purity. And so women are told how to dress, how to act, how to dance, not dance, and how to care for their fellow man's sexuality. Women are placed on the defensive in the church by being confirmed as a sexual object, their worth to their husbands being instructed by their sexual purity and what they can offer to their husband and his sexual needs. Bible verses are being brought out about women being quiet in the church, as they had been for centuries, along with Bible verses about women being subservient to their husbands, as they had been for centuries. And in the misuse of these types of theological abominations are the justifications that we have for systematically ruining an entire generations of women's self-worth. Husbands were taught to worry about the sex lives of their wives past and the state of their own daughters' vaginas, as if they had any control or anything they could do to control it. And of course, if they couldn't control their daughters' vaginas, then were they really the spiritual leaders that the Bible had asked them to be? Probably not.
Does any part of you think that it is quite patriarchal in that, there was chastity belts in the medieval ages? Is this a kind of almost a continuation of that?
I believe that there's freedom in submission, and so right now these young girls are voluntarily choosing to be obedient to their fathers, and in the same way that I choose to submit to my husband's leadership.
The purity culture in the 90s had alienated men and women from one another. We saw things that came out of books, like about dating, and talks about how men and women had differing roles in the relationships. And all of us that were captured by this movement were left reeling, trying to figure out, what do? We have two options. We can either throw away everything in its entirety, or we can try to exist within it. And I come from a place of trying to exist within it. I was a younger person in the 90s and early 2000s, and I did the dance with the best of them. I had a church that was willing to give me a list of all sorts of things that I was not allowed to do, or more importantly, all the qualities that I should be looking for in a prospective partner. Yet, I found myself very underinformed about my sexuality. I was taught to be afraid of my sexuality by the church, as if it were some kind of untamable monster that I had to somehow control. Yet, I was also abandoned to figure out the specific mechanics of sex on my own. I was not taught about safe sex or the dangers of sex, except for by the public school system, and I was never told what was and wasn't really allowed. In some ways, I was almost left with the impression that nothing was allowed, and that ever touching a girl, embracing a woman in any way, was a slippery slope to just completely penetrating them, which is ridiculous. Not to mention that just on the other side of marriage, the day you get married to your spouse, whom you've been afraid to touch for the last several years of dating, you are expected to absolutely bang the shit out of each other. There's this uncomfortable duality between purity culture that simultaneously teaches men and women to be afraid of their bodies until the day you slide the ring on your finger, and then this instant pressure for procreation the day that you are married.
We just really felt like that we need to give this area of our life to God.
We prayed, we said, Father, forgive us and give us a love for children like you love children. And we gave that area of our life to the Lord. And right after that, God blessed us with twins.
It's ridiculous, it's insane, and realistically, it's traumatizing for both men and women to transition to this pressure. The thought process of the church seems to me to be that we are supposed to basically just be edging our future spouses for years, not crossing this imaginary line until the evening you finally fill out the paperwork so that you are officially obliged to just fuck non-stop. There is a huge disconnect between the church and the culture that the church inhabits, which is kind of the problem that this channel explores anyways, but specifically in this case, I think the church harms the youth that they pretend to care about by being so confused with how people relate to one another in contemporary culture that men and women are being taught to fear each other's genitals for decades. And I do not believe that leads to well-developed adults or well-functioning relationships, much less marriages. And sure, you might say that in a way, there are parts of culture that Jesus does tell us to reject, and I agree with you. After all these years of abuse and the dire situations that I've been placed in with my own relationships, I still find myself wondering just how purity and abstinence fit in with my own belief system. Maybe it even still does in some minor ways. But regardless of that, the key to solving the problem is to get past the lack of communication. The church needs to not be afraid of hard topics in conversation. Always, time and time again, I find myself with a similar predicament. The church could tackle a hard topic, but that would require them to get uncomfortable. And being uncomfortable is not okay. Despite the Gospels seemingly tell us that Jesus wants us to do just that, get uncomfortable. For now, I need to denounce what this model of purity culture is. We've seen it take a lot of different shapes, and we've seen it result in a lot of different problematic behaviors, from the creation of needless fuel for sex pests and predators to the added stressors on marriages and the cause of divorce. If we do not stop forcing women into boxes and making men fear their own sex drives and creating monstrous oppressors in adherence to the patriarchal religious systems that have long lost their favor with the culture around us, we might as well just give up on evangelical churches altogether. Women aren't going to continuously buy into this cultic oppression, and as a man, I'm not going to continue to prescribe to a pseudo-Christianity that supposedly doesn't even take Jesus seriously enough to speak frankly on a subject like sex and sex education.
End of life for 8 victims, 6 of them Asian women. The victims gunned down at 3 Asian massage parlors, a crime that the suspect says, instead of being racially motivated, was fueled by something else.
He does claim that it was not racially motivated. He apparently has an issue, what he considers a sex addiction, and sees these locations as something that allows him to go to these places, and it's a temptation for him that he wanted to.
In the last 2 parts of this hopefully only 3-part series, we spoke about some biblical ideas of sex and how far away purity culture in the evangelical church is from that biblical basis of sex. And then we also talked about purity culture's racial past, as well as the way it deliberately burdens young women with the bearing of the brunt of the need to maintain their virginity for the sake of themselves and the men around them. And the result of all of that has left multiple generations disillusioned with the church's view on sexuality. Some pastors are coming to the conclusion that they must be the one to hold the line, maintaining that any young people they marry should not be living together. And other pastors are waking up and realizing that if they were to be that strict, they would never marry anyone under the age of 30 ever again. And it's in this tension that the church currently sits. How can the church reach out to a generation that is becoming increasingly secular while also maintaining the ideas of strict conservative sexuality? The answer is that while some more progressive denominations have backed off the purity culture conversation, along with other conversations around gay inclusion and things like alcohol use, the more conservative evangelicals have doubled down. If you watch the last part of this series, you may recognize this guy.
You talk about yourself as your daughter's boyfriend.
He was featured in mainstream news for his efforts to keep his daughters in purity balls, or these ceremonies where young girls would pledge their purity by signing contracts with their fathers. What you may not know is this guy is still around. He's even still working and preaching at the same church that his dad founded and handed to him.
Trans rights become civil rights, and once they become civil rights, then anybody who disagrees with them, or someone, say you hire.
And pastors that talk like old Ronald here, that have doubled down on purity culture, have begun to extend past the topics of men and women and gender roles, and now have moved on to bigger fish, like the disclusion of LGBTQ people from Christianity. But either way, pastors like this, which feed their congregations ideas about biblical masculinity and the subservient roles of women, have created an environment in our culture that leads these impressionable congregants of theirs to other, even more extreme voices. Which is why this...
If I'm the boss and I fire him because he's identifying as a woman or as a cat, I'm the one that's going to be fined. I am going to be taken to court, and my business will be sued, and maybe my livelihood destroyed because I identified him. He identified as one thing, and if he's fluid, he could be all those things in the same day. And I'm supposed to cater to this person in the work world. Now, this is going to create all kinds of absolute insanity just in the work world.
Sounds so similar in content to this.
If you want to chop your off, I have nothing against that. I'm not anti-gay. I'm not anti-transgender. I'm not anti any of these things. What I am anti is propagating your worldview on other people's children. If you're gay and you can't have kids, why do you now believe it's your right to go to other people's kids and tell them how to think? If you've decided that the type of sex you want to have will prevent you from procreating, that's your decision, right? You've decided that having sex with women isn't worth it for you. You don't want to have children. You want to have sex with men. Fine, your decision, and you're entitled to it. That does not give you the entitlement to go to other people's families who did decide to have children and raise them and try and program their children. Leave the kids alone. You can be as transgender as you like. Don't come talk to my kid about it.
There are very clearly grifters from outside the world of religion that have clung on to purity culture's idealizations, whether it's the promotion of masculinity, the desired male role as the head of the household, the subservient role of women, the traditional family values, the desire for racially segregated relationships, or maybe it's just the anti-LGBTQ rhetoric.
If you live 50 years as a man and then wake up on a Tuesday at 11 a.m. and decide you're a chick, you have a mental illness.
All of this is cultural war adjacent garbage, and it's found a place within the larger context of the quote-unquote traditional values that purity culture has been used to create and promote for decades now. And not only does the evangelical church hold a system of beliefs that leads to a right-wing radicalization, but they don't even half-heartedly attempt to distance themselves from these people.
Would you join me in welcoming our great friend and the 45th President of the United States of America, President Donald J. Trump. Come on up, Mr. President.
And the result of this is that the lines are blurred between pastor and far-right advocate, so much so that pastors don't even need to illegally endorse candidates in an attempt to sway politics. They just need to be vocal about their quote-unquote religious ideology on LGBTQ people, or their stand against drag queens. You express these views, and everyone knows which candidate you're probably leaning towards. And likewise, these sort of non-religious, over-masculine figureheads know exactly which buzzwords to use to instantly activate their religious audience, and this cultivates an appearance of legitimacy in the religious world.
If you look at teachings from the Bible, it talks about husbands being gentle and kind to your wives, loving, providing, and it tells wives to be submissive to your husbands. Now, the word submit means to respect the authority of your husbands. Now, if you look at this, what does this really mean?
This will eventually result in theologian adjacent status, even when they are in reality just a dumbass with some supplements to sell, or books that are ghostwritten on their behalf, or doomsday prepping supplies, or who the fuck is buying this? Purity culture specifically results in less educated audiences by design, where the people who are being told about sex and their sexuality are purposefully being withheld information, either because of parental pressure on the church or because of the church leadership itself. And in doing so, they're creating young men and young women who are sexually repressed and simultaneously also vastly underinformed. These people will feel confusion and guilt and anger towards both themselves, but also sometimes towards members of the opposite sex. This once again leaves the door open to toxic masculinity or even sexual violence.
Throw your hand. You give up so easily.
I don't give up, Stephen.
You give up so easily. I just said the only way out of this is discipline and respect. You said, then we're at an impasse.
Stephen, no, we are at an impasse, okay? I love you, but Stephen, your abuse is sick. Your abuse
Watch it.
is sick.
Watch it. Fucking watch it.
I'm gonna let go. I'll get what you need.
Hillary, you're creating this. If you had more discipline, if you had more respect, if you did your wifely duties, it's this very linear, like in his mind, very systematic breakdown of all of her poor behaviors and how she has created this situation. In his mind, he is being accurate, precise, and elevated. But the reality is, he is totally emotionally unregulated.
It's no coincidence that there are more sexual assaults taking place among the people that claim to be the most vocal about sexual righteousness. People who are confused in their sexualities and have become so repressed that they can fetishize even the most basic physical interaction from the opposite sex. Then combine with other mental illnesses or social disorders, and this leads to extremes in sexual behaviors and even aggression. For every Steven Crowder that we see in the news, there are thousands of nameless husbands enacting the same ruthless misogyny, just without the audience to influence and without the public image to disgrace. And we have an obligation to those people. Everyone knows the stereotype of the pastor's child being the wild one at the high school party, but we seem to forget that these unhinged stories of having unprotected sex at a party or committing to rampant substance abuse as a teenager can easily lead to an adult that is unable to grasp the concept of enthusiastic consent, for example, or unknowingly falls into a hate trap for women because they feel rejected by society's portrayal of them as being sex-obsessed, when in reality they just lack the sexual and social awareness to communicate with these women in the first place. And when it's not just the pastor's kid that's treated like an object of shame and regression, then you get full communities of these adult children who just simply do not understand how they fit in with the social fabric of our culture.
A stunning confession by a beloved pastor.
I committed adultery.
I was just 16 when you took my virginity on your office floor. Do you remember that? I know you do. You did things to my teenage body that had never and should have never been done.
She said she had been traumatized for 20 years by her experience at his hands. Then the woman's husband, Nate, joined in and held up some jewelry.
This was Bobby's covenant of purity ring, which she wore while this man had sex with her, and she felt ashamed all these years.
These lines the church ends up walking are precarious. On the one hand, there's a claim of intention. The church claims to be for the protection of children, but much like helicopter parents that are married to youth pastors, overreach is sometimes more harmful than just letting be. If the church continues to double down on cult-like messaging about who is in and who is out of Christianity because of something as unknowable as your sex life, then the church will only continue to be more and more of a cult in general. We must resist the pressure to allow ourselves to be judged by the church, even as members of it. Do not settle for churches that promote hostile mindsets towards women and minorities, whether direct, like Ronald, or indirect, like many other evangelical churches. If the church as a whole in America is to survive at all, then these evangelicals need to be pushed away as the outcasts of society that they are. Because these people in these pews will realize that their leaders are idiots, and they just need to see that there are other legitimate versions of Christianity out there. And more importantly, they need to see and learn about the concept of grace, which I believe exists in Scripture, and it extends to all members of the world, even ones that you do not think deserve it. Thank you everyone for tuning into the series. I hope you found something useful here. Subscribe for more ranting, and thanks for watching. Love you.